Hello, my name is Hans Hanley, and I will be presenting the work, A Special Operation, a Quantitative Approach to Dissecting and Comparing Different Media Ecosystems Coverage of the Russo-Ukrainian War. This work was done in conjunction with Deepak Kumar and Professor Zakir Duremarich in the first 2 months following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. On February 24, 2022, the Russian Federation, led by President Vladimir Putin, began a purported special military operation to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. In conjunction with the military operation, the Russian state government also simultaneously launched various disinformation and propaganda campaigns, ranging from the idea that the Ukrainian government and military are filled with neo-Nazis to the idea that the Russian government invaded Ukraine to uncover and shut down US-funded bioweapons laboratories. While many of these disinformation narratives were parroted elsewhere on the internet, different ecosystems have had vastly different perspectives on these stories. For example, while CNN reported on how biolabs within Ukraine were actually there to secure Soviet-era weapons, TASS, a Russian outlet, pushed the narrative that the US was funding the creation of new bioweapons, and Xinhua, a Chinese outlet, largely echoed TASS. In fact, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs in particular echoed and broadcasted the story about US-funded bioweapons in Ukraine. The Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs Twitter account even posted this image, questioning the US involvement in labs in Ukraine. Unlike in Western media ecosystems, this story was heavily reposted and shared throughout the Chinese media ecosystem. In order to understand the interaction of how different news ecosystems covered the Russian invasion of Ukraine, in this work we asked the following questions. 1. What narratives surrounding the Russian invasion of Ukraine dominated Western, Russian, and Chinese news ecosystems respectively? And 2. Did Russian disinformation narratives affect Chinese coverage? And if so, to what degree? To answer these questions, we gathered Ukraine-related news articles, Twitter threads, and Weibo posts published between January 1st and April 15th, 2022, including 4,500 English-language Western articles from 8 prominent websites, including the New York Times, CNN, and Fox News, 3,600 English-language news articles from 10 prominent Russian websites, including Russia Today and Sputnik News, and finally 3,200 English-language news articles from 7 Chinese outlets, including websites like People's Daily and Xinhua. In addition to these articles, we collected the Weibo and Twitter data posted by our set of Chinese news outlets during the same period of time. For those wondering, Weibo, in simplified terms, is a Chinese version of Twitter. From our collected news articles, we then utilized partially labeled Dirichlet allocation to identify shared and distinct topics between Western, Chinese, and Russian news outlets. This is such that we model shared latent topics amongst all the articles that we gather, as well as topics distinct to each of the Western, Chinese, and Russian news ecosystems. In addition, utilizing a normalized point-wise mutual information metric, we then identify the keywords distinct to each media ecosystem. Finally, in order to understand the influence of Russian news outlets on Chinese news reporting, we examined Chinese use of Russian news outlets as official sources in the reporting across news articles, tweets, and Weibo posts. Examining the shared topics among our news ecosystems, we observe an emphasis on the troop buildup by Russia on the Ukrainian border in Belarus prior to the war, the sanctions by the Biden administration on the Russian government and Russian individuals, and the shelling of Ukrainian cities. Looking at the distinct topics, we observe an emphasis in Western media on the Russian massacre at the Ukrainian city of Bucha and the plight of women and children. We observe an emphasis in Russian news articles on the propaganda stories of US-funded biological weapons laboratories and Ukrainian neo-Nazis. And finally, in Chinese news media ecosystems, we observe an emphasis on negotiations, peace talks, and again on the disinformation story of US-funded biological weapons laboratories. In addition to examining the topics present within the different news ecosystems, we utilize normalized point-wise mutual information to understand words association with different news ecosystems. As reported by the Atlantic Council, the spelling of Ukrainian names and cities has taken on a political edge. From our analysis, we find in their reporting on events in Ukraine, different ecosystems have, as such, decided to either utilize the Ukrainian or Russian spelling of words. Here, based on MPMI, we see that the Western ecosystem, in contrast to both the Russian and Chinese ones, utilizes Ukrainian spelling of cities and President Zelensky's surname. We further observe a focus by Russian news outlets on the Donbass region of Ukraine and by Chinese news outlets on China's potential role in the conflict and the economic fallout of the invasion. Having observed a particular emphasis by Chinese news outlets on the Russian disinformation story of US-funded bioweapons, we next decided to investigate if and how Russian news outlets have affected Chinese news reporting about Ukraine. To do this, we look specifically at how often 7 prominent Chinese news outlets have referenced Russian websites in their reporting on Ukraine across their news articles, Twitter, and their Weibos. As seen in this graph plotting the usage of Russian sources by Chinese news outlets, we see a large spike immediately preceding the Russian invasion of Ukraine across all three platforms examined. In addition to observing a heavy reliance on Russian sources within Chinese news reporting on Ukraine, we further observed that many of these outlets that utilized Russian sources also posted about Russian disinformation stories heavily on their Weibos. These stories include the idea that the Ukrainian government and military are filled with neo-Nazis and that the Russian government invaded Ukraine to uncover and shut down US-funded bioweapons laboratories. Indeed, extending our dataset to 39 Chinese news outlets, we calculate a 0.71 Pearson correlation between a Chinese news outlet's use of Russian news sources and the number of stories that they publish about these two disinformation stories. Fitting a negative binomial model using the posting behavior of these 39 Chinese news outlets, we indeed find that for every 42 citations of Russian news sources, the expected number of Weibo posts about these two Russian disinformation stories doubles. In conclusion, in this work, we utilize a host of techniques to characterize the difference in coverage of the Russo-Ukrainian war between different news ecosystems. While we focus on PLDA and MPMI for this talk, we refer you to the paper for several other analyses, including sentiment analysis and word embedding comparisons that we performed. From this analysis, we identify reliance on Russian disinformation by Chinese news outlets. Examining this further, we find that Chinese news has increasingly utilized Russian news outlets as sources, and that this use is correlated with the publication of Russian disinformation. We want to emphasize that events like the Russo-Ukrainian war are global, with no country in the world not affected. Given the highly polarized and global nature of this war, understanding how different media ecosystems are covering it is imperative to collectively understanding broader perceptions of the conflict. Previous studies that have focused only on news targeted at Western audiences are likely limited and may experience bias. Future works should examine events from multiple perspectives across different news ecosystems. Thank you, and you can find me at the following links.